Welcome to the Fran Snyder Podcast, where I talk to artists and music fans to explore how music connects us through great stories and experiences. Brought to you by the Listening Room Network. Today's guest, Alan Williams. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Fran. How are you today?
Good. I first learned about you through your Birdsong at Morning project. We'll get into that a little bit. You've had a pretty fascinating history in the music business. So before we get into house concerts and pandemic adjustments and all that stuff, let's talk a little bit about where you're from. I saw Asheville in your bio. Is that where you were born or just kind of where you grew up?
That's where I grew up. I was born in central Ohio and we moved around a lot when I was very little, but I think we were in Asheville from like the age of 5 on. So that's definitely my hometown. My mother still lives there. It's a markedly different place now than it was when I was there growing up. When I was there, you could go downtown in the middle of the day and literally not see a human being.
Really?
It was completely dead. At one point when I was growing up, there was even, I think, a referendum to knock down most of the downtown and put a mall there, which just sends shivers down my spine because, pre-pandemic, Asheville has become such a thriving center for art, culture, music, the visual arts and handcraft and great restaurants and a lot of brew pubs and breweries, that sort of thing. And a bit of a little miracle to see this thing happen in my hometown and then to sustain itself, because I sort of saw it happening and thought, right, well, this will work for a couple of years and then it's going to peter out. But instead, it's really kept going. And I think in an interesting way, bridges a lot of gaps between America, as it were. So I remember many years ago, there was simultaneously in the same week, Asheville was named, I think by Fortune magazine, the top retirement destination of the United States. And Rolling Stone magazine dubbed it the freak capital of the United States, same week. And I thought both things are true. And it's really those cultures and several others working together, somehow working alongside and kind of, supporting one another in a way that I think lends Asheville that sort of the character that now when people ask, where are you from? And I say Asheville, I don't have to explain where it is. They all know, oh, I've been there, or I have friends there, or it sounds like a great place. And it really is. So.
Yeah, there's a bit of a parallel to where I am now. And I think it's happening with a lot of sort of small to medium-sized cities around the country, this sort of urban renewal. I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it was always known as, God's waiting room and the home of the newlywed and the newly dead. I mean, it had all these monikers. And in the past 20 years, the median age has gone from like 55 to 30. And
wow,
it's an arts-driven town. There's still plenty of seniors and retired folks here, but a ton of younger folks and professionals have moved into the urban core, and the city's just really thriving in terms of the arts community and on all levels. So it's great to see that in so many towns across the U.S., but certainly Asheville is emblematic of that as well. From there, I know that you went to the New England Conservatory of Music. Was that a direct trip, or were there some stops in between?
That was a direct trip, but I did a sightseeing venture maybe before that. Between my junior and senior year of high school, some friends of mine and I went up to Berklee in Boston, the Berklee College of Music, to see they have these summer programs. And I think before I went up there, I was sure that was definitely where I wanted to go to school, and definitely the kind of music I wanted to be involved in, very jazz fusion or something, I don't know. And I just had a reckoning while I was up there that I wasn't particularly enthused with Berklee. I thought there was a lot of posing going on in the lobby, and
maybe not enough caviar.
Not any caviar. And while there were really some great musicians, great teachers, and students that were floating around, you'd walk down a hallway and hear something stunning. But it didn't feel right for me. Yeah. And fortunately, one of my friends that I came up with, Greg Porter, his father had read an article about this guy, Rand Blake, a pianist, and who ran a small program at New England Conservatory, just a block and a half away from where I'd been staying all this time, and said, you should really look into that. And we were fortunate in that this was the summer that Ronald Reagan decided to shut down the air traffic controllers union so we couldn't get home. It was like our flight out of Boston was canceled. There were no flights for days, and killing time in Boston. Like, well, let's walk down there to NEC and see what that's about. Stumbled around the basement and got apprehended in the dark by somebody who turned out to be Rand Blake's assistant and said, oh, well, come on in and I'll put Rand on the phone and he'll talk to you. And it was such a complete change from Berklee in terms of it's just very friendly and human. And Rand is a sweet soul who I just was suddenly, wow, I don't know anything about you. I don't know much about what you're talking about, but I just like you. Both Greg and I auditioned for Third Stream and got in and came up together. And we were roommates in college and roommates out of the dorm. Third Stream, the history of Third Stream comes from Gunther Schuller, the composer-conductor, French hornist, who was really all about bridging gaps. He was playing in the classical world and composing modern 20th century music, but also was involved in some of the Birth of the Cool recordings with Miles Davis and was friends with John Lewis from Modern Jazz Quartet. And they started thinking about classical and jazz hybrid stuff. So this was what Third Stream was, the melding of those two things.
Yeah, so I guess it was called Third Stream Studies, but I guess it's been renamed to sort of contemporary improv now.
Contemporary improv is what it is now. Yeah. So by the time I got there and Rand Blake was running the place, it had already shifted its focus to be melding. You can, it was algebraic, A and B are open. They could be anything, but a melding of something, less specifically jazz and classical. And that has lent itself to a more expanded version of what they now call contemporary improvisation, or everybody refers to it as CI. And it's more about a way of approaching music by ear rather than by eye that sets it apart from more traditional music programs. Rand and Gunther believed that was important that you apprehend music orally in order to really understand it. And that you should understand it before you start melding it. I think they were very nervous about just sort of casual appropriations of ideas of, okay, we'll put a trumpet on it and call it jazz or whatever it will be. And so they wanted to have a deeper connection to the music. And it was really eye-opening for me as a piano player coming in. I had played jazz, and I'd played classical music, and I played a lot of pop music. When I played classical music, it was always with the score, and I never listened to classical recordings. And they had me learn some Bartók pieces by ear rather than from a score. And it changed my view because I realized that I was segmenting one type of music from another based on how I was engaging with it. And once I started learning classical music by ear, it was no longer classical music in this pedestal separate from all the low rent stuff that I really liked. And instead it just became another musical expression that was perfectly available to you, or maybe not if you didn't gravitate towards it. And that was the big moment for me to sort of change my worldview about music in general. So anyway, CI is a big program at NEC now, and there have been a lot of great musicians that have come through Third Stream and CI. I think probably the most well-known lately would be the band Lake Street Dive. They're all CI people.
Yeah.
Aoife O'Donovan came through there. And then, John Medeski was in school with me back in that day. So there's a lot of people that have come out, and they're the people that tend to not fit easily into categories, and yet can be perfectly acceptable, accessible music.
Yeah, that reminds me, there's a group called Classical Revolution. It's an organization around the United States, probably beyond the States now, but they started, I think, in San Francisco, and their motive was to make classical music more informal and playing it almost like taking classical music to the bars, where you think of like a classical music open mic night type of situation, where they're really just bringing down the barriers and encouraging people to clap and hoop at any time. You don't have to wait till, you don't have to be silent during the pause between the movements and all these kinds of things, and informal appearance, all that kind of stuff. And I love that. I love I mean, it's a different take than what you were describing, but the idea of who learns classical music by ear, but you learn pop music by ear all the time. And I, as a performer, I get frustrated. It's just like, if I have to learn my songs and be able to play them on stage without looking at a music sheet, why should they get away with it? Even beyond that, I think, if you're not glued to the score, I think even in an orchestra, you could have a more palpable connection with the audience if you occasionally catch their eye.
Yeah, there are performing groups, classical groups, usually chamber music, that do perform without scores.
Yeah.
And I think it's for that reason. It's so that they are really engaging with one another and really listening. It's kind of interesting when you think about the term chamber music, right? Because it meant music made in small spaces. It's a house concert. It's instrumental music for house concerts.
Yeah.
And with all that attendant intimacy and presence, and not the formalized clapping between movements, sort of like, I think that's where that music grew from. And then putting it on a concert hall stage is sort of putting it in the wrong environment in a way. I think having a string quartet play in your living room, you get to see the inner workings, you get to see the eye contact between musicians, and I think it really enhances what you're hearing. That's not all that different from what happens in any kind of performer in a house concert setting. So
yeah, and so let's use that as a bridge. Let's keep talking about house concerts, and we'll get back to my notes afterwards, because we have to spend some time here. Your discovery of house concerts, obviously, chamber music, parlor concerts. There's a long history, even before the tradition adapted to sort of modern times with the suggested donation and all those types of things. What was your first exposure, and was it did you have an immediate affection for it, or did it seem a little bizarre at first when it came to house concerts?
I think the first time I did anything like a house concert, there was, we have some friends on Martha's Vineyard, and there was some sort of like fake festival that they had staged for that weekend, kind of a very vineyard thing to do. And as part of it, they asked, actually, I think we brought Greg, the bass player, the same guy I went to school with, by the way, is still making music with me. He and my wife, Darlene, and I came out to the vineyard to play a little music because we just formed Birdsong. And we're
so Darlene in the group is also your wife?
Yes.
Okay.
And so we had just started, I guess, making music. I don't think we'd even recorded anything at that point. But our friends asked us to come play. And so in somebody's large, very nice barn/living room, whatever, summer place, people gathered around, they pulled the sofas and chairs around, and we played. And I'd never played in that setting. I played on stages and always had, a safe distance from any audience members. And instead, there I was, and it was summer. I'm in my bare feet, and there was such a casual thing about it that I think, especially for me getting back into the performing thing at all after an extended break from it, the intimacy of that sort of felt like, oh, okay, I just muffed that guitar chord. I laughed about it. This woman on the couch laughed about it too. And we moved on. The world didn't end. And instead, I'm not thinking about that moment anymore. I'm thinking about, hey, she laughed. I want to play something for her, see if I can get her to laugh again. And having direct contact with the audience, it basically took away all the negatives about performing that I always had and filled it with all these potential, like, well, maybe it's just, if somebody responds, they responded. What a great thing that is. So that's when I started seeking out other ways of making music in those settings. And then I think when I discovered, I guess it was concerts in your home at that point, quite developed, it was like, wow, there's a whole world that does this. I want to be a part of that.
You mentioned something that's triggering a memory of one of my favorite stories, and I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard this, but it's Herbie Hancock talking about playing with Miles Davis, and it was a big gig, big stadium, whatever, just high pressure show. He was new in the band at the time, I think, and all that I've heard about Miles Davis up until that point was that he was an absolute jerk and just not a great human being. But on stage, Herbie Hancock describes one day he's up there and he's playing a song and he just plays an absolute clam of a note, like, oops, trying not to turn beet red. There was a really ugly note. And Miles heard it and decided decided to turn it into the right note by what he played afterwards. He found a way to incorporate Herbie's mistake into like, hey, let's use that. Let's take it somewhere cool.
Right.
And for Herbie, he describes that as just this incredible act of musical generosity, because, you know, he could have been, you know, just torn apart afterwards, and it was never talked about. It was just like, no, we're just going to play with it. Let's go.
Yeah. And there's even a couple of ways to play with it, because you can imagine Miles reinforcing that note in a mocking sort of phrase to sort of repeat the error and just really needle poor little Herbie Hancock there.
Yeah.
Or use it and develop it and say, okay, that actually, thank you, Herbie, that gave me an idea. And that is such a generous thing. And I love that story, partly because it rewrites what our expectations of about what right and wrong is in music.
Yeah.
And two, because it highlights when musicians play together, there's a lot at stake, there's a lot on the line, but there's also a lot of possibility there for finding things that neither one would have come up with on their own. That's what, I love making music.
Yeah, I mean, that happens in the studio a lot too, right? Little mistakes to wind up making the song.
That's the thing, usually. Yeah, exactly.
So let's backtrack to my notes here. So from Third Stream, I guess there was more playing, and somehow you wound up getting a deal with Island Records, the Chris Blackwell's thing, for a while. I'm sure that was an up and down thing. I actually have a tiny little bit of history with Island Records, so
okay.
So I'm fascinated, always fascinated by when I hear about people who had experiences, because obviously they signed some monster acts. I think U2 was on there for a while. Bob Marley and others. But yeah, tell us how you got on their radar and sort of what happened during those years.
Right, exactly. So after I got out of school, I was in a band called Knots and Crosses with a K-N-O-T-S. We did what every band does. You play bars and you make demos. And this was the late 80s. We were obsessed with trying to get a record deal. So it was always scrape together enough money to make a demo and then give it to some industry people and then get a lawyer to give it to industry people. And it was all about sort of developing music, or at least the recording process. Like none of our fans ever heard any of the recordings because it was all demos for the industry. And that we got a lot of flirtatious little moments. I had some people, some A&R from Capitol and RCA and Chrysalis, like people were coming and checking it out, but nobody was in love. And we probably weren't ready for prime time anyway. But what we also realized, I kind of came to this after a few years of that, was, maybe we should stop waiting on the industry to discover us and just put something out for our fans. We recorded a little cassette that we put out and sold at gigs, and people bought it, and we sold enough of them to cover the cost of the recording, which obviously we were not getting anything back from the demos. So this was a huge turning event. And then I said, you know what, everyone's, making demos and tapes and stuff, but we should make a CD. We should make a compact disc, because even in the early 90s, it was relatively rare for a self-financed group to put out a CD. And so we recorded a CD. The entire budget for the entire project was $1,000, which was about $900 more than we had, but we nonetheless did it. And put it out and did the things that shouldn't work. We sent them to radio stations out of nowhere, not understanding how radio worked. And luckily, in our case, a couple of program directors also forgot how radio was supposed to work, and they actually opened stuff that came not from a promotion company or a label, and gave it a listen. And I remember a couple of stations in Maine, because the band was half in Boston and half in Maine at the time, started playing it. And in the sort of Portland, Maine area, we started selling CDs out of the record stores. And I was working in one of those record stores, so I had the weird sensation of selling my CD to people who didn't even know it was me, and you're just selling them. And we started to draw enough of a crowd that we were like, okay, a few hundred people, and then, well, let's go to that 500-seater. We can't possibly fill a 500. Yes, we did. And so we were promoting our own shows and doing all this great stuff. And then a station in Boston picked it up. And when they picked it up, it started to really sell. And we ended up in the sort of top 10 of the local Tower Records charts and all this stuff. It's like Dire Straits' new album is number 9 and we're number 8. How can that possibly be? Yeah. And because of that, record labels were like, how is that? Who is screwing up our sales chart? And we eventually got more labels looking at us. Again, a lot of flirtations, no buyers. We put out a second CD. And at that point, finally, Island Records kicked in. Now, it was an interesting moment because Island, the guy that aligned us with Island was Denny Cordell. And Denny Cordell had a long history. He produced Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale, the first Joe Cocker records, the first Tom Petty records, Leon Russell stuff, and then retired. He actually, I think, brought Mango, which was essentially the Harder They Come soundtrack, to Island Records. He and Chris Blackwell were friends, and then Denny went off and, I think, raised horses or something really aristocratic, but got bored and decided to get back into the business. And we became a pet project for him. Which was great. It was like, oh my God, this famous guy worked with all these famous records. Yeah. A little bit old at this point. Those are no longer current. But so he came in, and Knots and Crosses was a weird band in that there were 3 of us, my wife at the time, Carol Noonan, myself, and Rick Harris, the guitarist. And then we kind of had a fluctuating rhythm section depending on who was available. So he comes in and says, I don't really like the rhythm section on your record. And we're like, oh, well, that's actually okay. We were trying to figure out an excuse to you because we don't know who's in our band. And he said, yeah, I think what you need to do is go play with some Cajun musicians. We weren't that kind of band, but okay. So the Island deal was predicated on these sessions that we did in first Crowley, Louisiana, in a little studio, which historically is really important. It's where Slim Harpo recorded. It's where Kitty Wells recorded It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels. And it also is where Thomas Dolby and Paul Simon had recorded in the 80s, sort of updating this little backroom studio. So we went to Crowley, and we worked with members of Steve Riley and the Mamou Playboys, a really great Cajun band. Not the exact band, but Steve and a couple of other members of that group. So it was this weird hybrid. It wasn't really, I don't know. It was very strange, very strange. And we're living in Lafayette, Louisiana, recording in Crowley, completely in our own little world. The saving grace of that was the engineer that was brought in was Jimmy Johnson, who was part of the Muscle Shoals scene. And we also ended up going up to Muscle Shoals to record as part of this weird little trek. Jimmy was great, and the Crowley sessions were kind of a mess. We didn't really finish anything, and it was very strange. And we got to the Muscle Shoals, and we did some more recording with those guys, with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section. That was the high point of the whole deal, because like Roger Hawkins, the drummer, and he was 15 when he played on Percy Sledge, When a Man Loves a Woman. I mean, he's like a kid. All these guys were just young. But he has such a beautiful feel and was such a sweet guy. I remember we played a song that had an outro where it just sort of cycled over the chords. It's supposed to be guitar solo, 4 chords, and it's going to fade out. So you play for a long time, and finally somebody stops. And it became this great lesson in how to do something minimally. So every 4 bars, he needed to do a drum fill, and he did a different fill every time, nothing flashy. I couldn't figure out. I was like, I think that's it. I've run out of ideas. I cannot imagine what he's going to do next. And then he would do something, and it was just like, I hope this never ends. I could play these 4 chords the rest of my life. That's a great thing. Anyway, those sessions were great, but we were pressed for time, and nothing really got kind of to the finished stage. Right around that time, Chris Blackwell decided to sell the label to Polygram. So we ended up getting in this weird hybrid state where we were on the label, but nothing was happening and no one was returning calls. And it's sort of like, maybe we're getting dropped. I don't know. No one, like, we don't even know what's going on. And then I read in Billboard, Blackwell to sell Island. And the next, like that afternoon, I got a call from our lawyer saying, I have really bad news. And they basically purged everybody that wasn't U2, Bob Marley, or the Cranberries, or Melissa Etheridge. I think that was basically it, because those were the people that were still selling at that time. And, we probably would have gotten dropped anyway because the tapes were just really strange. It was a bit of a shame. It was a band that was challenging. My wife and I, Carol Noonan, had split up while we were making these records. We were divorced by the time we were working with Island. We were booked to play the Newport Folk Festival, and the deal fell through, and we were tired of each other and just decided to stop. And I was like, sorry, I had to call the people that gave us the slot at Newport and say we're breaking up. It's really a shame. In hindsight, I realized we had something good going. We had our own label. We were putting out records. We were making money, like good money, because we sold about 30,000 copies of a record that we owned completely. It cost us $1 per copy to manufacture. We were making a lot of profit on this stuff. We were booking our own shows, booking concert halls and filling them. But we still had this weird industry mindset about we must have a company behind us to justify our existence. We would do stuff like we would book a rock club in Boston. And I remember settling up at the end of the night and the guy going, "Wow, I thought you guys were crazy, but you made money. Here's your take of it." He said, "It's weird. There was a band here from Vermont last week that did the same thing. I don't understand it." It was Fish. And it was like this moment. Ani DeFranco was putting out her stuff. Fish was doing their bit all the same time. And if I'd just been thinking a little more, as they did, they just developed what they did on their own and became very entrepreneurial and had massively successful careers as a result of it. We were very short-sighted. Anyway, so that was the demise of Noughts and Crosses and the weird Island flirtation. And he felt really burned by the whole industry thing.
Yeah. So how long after that did you start doing like engineering and producing records? I know you worked with Lucy Kaplansky, Patty Larkin, Kris Delmhorst, the Nudes. I just met Walter Parks.
Walter, yeah, great.
A couple months ago at a house concert here in actually in Clearwater. He's fantastic.
Scarily talented. He can do so many things. It's he's amazing.
Yeah. And especially playing as a trio and just ripping it apart at a house. It was just so good. So tell me, I guess, how was that an easy transition? Were you just friendly with all these Boston area folks?
Well, that's through Darlene. So I had engineered a chunk of the Noughts and Crosses and produced them. And so people were asking me, "Hey, you got on the radio with your stuff. How can you produce me for cheap?"
Gotcha.
So that became part of that way. And then when I met Darlene, who had worked with Noughts and Crosses on some demos, she had already established herself as an engineer and producer, and she had done Patty Larkin's first few records and Katie Curtis's first few records. And she was sort of in the Boston scene. She was the go-to person. She did a Bill Morrissey record that had Suzanne Vega and Sean Colvin and all those people on it. I was like, yeah, okay. Oh, she recorded Sean Colvin's infamous live tape, the thing that got her the deal with Columbia.
Oh, nice.
If you are enjoying this podcast, can you pause for a moment to like, review, and subscribe? Please help the world discover our music community and the wonderful artists we support. Your feedback makes a difference.
I remember also Dar Williams' first just incredible record. And you wind up, I guess, being her musical director.
That was interesting. So Darlene, as always, was the first choice, right? So now Dar's management at the time had been interested in Noughts and Crosses. I actually remember having a meeting with them when I knew we had already been dropped by Island, but I wasn't telling anybody. And they were talking about management, how they could really, and I was like, what am I going to do? So flash forward a few years, I think Dar had put together, it was for the, to promote the End of the Summer record. So sort of like her third independent label thing. She'd actually done a few other things as well. But, and for that, they wanted a band because the records were getting more and more produced. She had invited a few people to join her on stage, and evidently it was a bit of a mess. So there was some anxiety on the label and the management's part about that. So they wanted her to work with somebody that could put together a band for her. And they asked Darlene. Darlene's like, "Nah, I'm in the middle of a few records. I don't think so." But Alan does a band, and her management knew Noughts and Crosses, as I said. So they said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea." So Dar Williams had put together the musicians she wanted to play with, which did not include a bass player. So that was like, okay. And Darlene and I went up to, I think, Dave Chalfont's house from the Neils. They were rehearsing in his living room. And we just sat in, and Darlene listened and talked a little bit. I think the tour plan was to have Richard Shindell open for Dar and then sit in as the guitarist in the band. And Richard's a great guitar player, not exactly an electric lead guitar player, but a beautiful sort of acoustic guitar player and a great voice. So it was this odd hodgepodge of musicians. And Darlene sort of talked, and then basically it was my audition. And we were working on something, and I turned to Dar and said, is there any way that you would mind not playing for the first verse or so and then coming in on the chorus, which is a little bit of a ballsy thing to ask the artist. Can you not play on your song? And I just quickly came up with a quick arrangement about bringing people in. And to Dar's eternal credit, she is very open. She's really a joy to work with, because she's like, okay, sure. And she let them do their thing, and she sang the thing. And then I was like, yeah, now feel that drum coming, and boom, we hit it. And just as I did that, the management walked in and they were like, what have they done to her hit single? And then it hit. And he was like, that's going to work great on stage. I was like, yeah, all right. So I got the gig. And we had a great summer rehearsing, getting ready for the band tour. And I also say, like in Dar Williams, she was a writer. In my mind, she was a songwriter, not so much of a performer as a writer, like a first-class writer right from the get-go. And I think she grew into being a first-class performer, but it wasn't necessarily, and especially as her guitar playing was a little bit like, we'll get by, but it wasn't, it was a challenge. But she has an amazing work ethic. And so I would give her notes and ask her to change things, and she would practice. She was there for every minute of every rehearsal. And I just felt like, okay, that's somebody who's got a lot on her plate and is ambitious and is generous, trying to bring Richard along. The Cry, Cry, Cry project we did after that with Darlene and I producing, she and Lucy Kaplansky and Richard Shindell. It was, again, an act of generosity. Let's give some exposure to songwriters. I just feel like there's an ethic about Dar that I learned a lot from, in terms of when somebody meets with some success, then you bring others along and it establishes a broader community. So I found working with Dar to be a turning point, not so much career-wise, but just in terms of my thinking about values. The weird problem for me was right at that point, I had fallen into teaching at a university and was considering going to grad school. And I remember Dar and I had this conversation. She's like, why do you want to do that? And I said, I don't really know. Because she said, because we could bring you on. I mean, you play guitar and you play keyboards and you sing and you could be in the band and it would be really helpful. And I was like, yeah, I can see that. I'd be happy to do it, but I think I'm going to enroll in classes. Lucy was really supportive because she had that academic background. She was somebody who, she has a psychology degree, and she was, doing music on the side until music became a full-time thing for her. So she really understood a bifurcated world and was very supportive.
So this is how you wind up going to Brown to get a PhD in ethnomusicology.
Yeah.
What is that?
That's an excellent question. And if you ask a dozen ethnomusicologists, you'll get probably 13 different answers. I think, again, it was like I'd started teaching as an adjunct at a university, and the chair there said, I can't hire you full-time without an advanced degree. And I said, I don't know what I could possibly get an advanced degree in, because I'm just not that smart and I don't know anything. And I went to a conservatory. I haven't written a paper since high school. I don't really know anything about that world. But someone pointed me to ethnomusicology and said, because it's so vaguely defined, there may be a place for you in it. And I said, well, I like the argument there.
That's like starting a relationship. My life is such a mess that you're welcome to join in.
Exactly. Who could resist that invitation, right? So I looked into it, and I was really not sure this was going to work at all. So I looked on a map and said, okay, I'm willing to drive an hour. And I'm not going to relocate because I have a feeling this is not going to work. So I'm not going to upend my life. So I'll drive an hour. And there were basically 3 programs that had graduate work in ethnomusicology, which seemed, again, because it was open-ended, might be the thing for me. Harvard, Brown, and Tufts, and whatever, convoluted story. I ended up going to Brown, which I never moved to Providence. It was an hour driving. 6 days a week. I was also teaching in Lowell, Massachusetts, which was half an hour from where I was living, 2 days a week. So I was often getting up and driving up to Lowell to teach, driving an hour and a half down to Providence to take classes all day and night, come back home, do it again, do it again. So it was really exhausting and terrifying and invigorating. And the beautiful thing for me about ethnomusicology and the program at Brown was they had all these world music ensembles to play in. And after the Island Records thing, I had actually stopped making music entirely, put the instruments away. I was in studios working with musicians and friends, but I wasn't playing. And I got this whole, problem in my mind about it. But at Brown, I was able to play in the gamelan and play in the Arabic music ensemble and the African drumming ensemble. It was like, okay, nobody knows this music. You're new to it. There's no expectation that you know anything about it. Here's an instrument you've never played. Make it work. And I just discovered the discovery of making music and the joy of making music. And it was so not what music had been for me since before the conservatory, all about your career and your future and it must count.
So this is just pure fun exploration. And
yeah, exactly. Because I remember even the Knots and Crosses days, you'd be at a show and there'd be 500 people loving what you're doing. And I was oblivious to it. I was looking down like the back of the room. Is the industry guy that's supposed to show up tonight here? And just not in the moment, missing what was really happening. So to have fun making music was almost a new feeling to me. And there was a guy that ran the program at the time. He was a old-time string fiddler kind of guy. So he had an ensemble, and it was open to everyone. There was never an audition, and it would be 17 fiddle players and 8 banjos, and a bunch of guitars, and oh wow, what a racket they could make, right? Because these were not necessarily virtuosos. It was here's a bow, good luck with that thing, and grinding away on your fiddle. It was a horrible sound in many ways, but the joy on people's faces was so telling. And it reminded me that we should make music. And so part of the Birdsong at Morning thing was, I mentioned this to Darlene, and Darlene had done the same thing I'd done, only with even more of a gap. She had put away the guitars in the late 70s. She had been making music and playing, performing with Eric von Schmidt, like the old Cambridge folk crowd, and had put this aside to be a record producer, et cetera. So I pulled her guitar out of the closet, and it was 30 years in that closet. It was really a long time away, a dozen years for me, basically. And so I said, Jeff's got this idea about everyone should just come and play. It doesn't matter. And I started talking to Greg, our bass player, who had also put the bass away, was in a totally different gig. I said, there's a lot of us. Let's get together in the living room and bring our instruments, and it won't matter how rusty we are. We don't have audiences. This isn't serious. It's just to try to play again. And we had 6 or 7 people that were coming every now and then. It's like very loose. And then gradually we ran out of songs because nobody was like feeling comfortable putting forward their song. It's like, well, we can play a Beatles song. Yeah, that'll be fun. And then you run out of Beatles songs to play, and suddenly there's this great void. What are we going to do?
Hang on now. Yeah. How can you run out of Beatles songs to play? I'll let that go. But
well, I mean, we crafted an amazing thing at Revolution Number 9, but after a while, you just run out of I fell into the gap. I threw a song into the void, and that particular day, only Darlene and Greg bothered to come.
Yeah.
I played this little song, and I started to get to the chorus, and they spontaneously harmonized, and suddenly it wasn't like the scattering 7 people strumming away without focus. Like a little sound happened, and we all stopped and said, whoa, that was really interesting. And we did it again, and I said, I'm sorry, you guys, we could take this seriously if you wanted to. And so we decided to do it.
Looking at your website, you could spend days reading all the content. It's incredible. It's incredible the different fields that you've touched. And I guess from this PhD, you also got into doing some academic work. You've written in lots of peer-reviewed journals. I'm going to skip going into that for now, but I will link to it because I did check out one article called Technostalgia and the Cry of the Lonely Recordist. That title just really struck me, so I started to dig into there. But skipping that, I want to go ahead and let's get into Birdsong at Morning. This was the name It Was and Is the name of your trio, but you also have live from the Aviary, and then now even yoga from the Aviary. So there's definitely a bird theme going on that I want to see if there's some deep psychological
it's really just a matter of developing branding more than anything. That the name Birdsong at Morning comes from a line in a Robert Louis Stevenson poem, I'll bring you starshine at night or whatever, and Birdsong at Morning, very romantic British 19th century poetry. But that's not where I found it. Where I found it is it's actually a little sub-chapter heading in The Joy of Sex, the 70s thing.
Brilliant.
And I remember reading that going, well, no, that's a poetic phrase, and then understanding where it came from. Like, oh, I see it is. I don't know why, but I looked at it and said, that could be a band name. That's such an interesting little name to see it in print. And I held on to that for a few years and many years. And so I came to Darlene and Greg and said, how about Birdsong at Morning? And they were like, what? It's too long. It's too weird. I was like, yeah, so that feels about right. Because I think we play songs that are probably a little too long, a little too weird, and have to be explained. So fine, let's just make that our name. And they went along with it, which was good. So then having established that, you start working in the bird references. And we had always, every little rehearsal space that we would rent and every little sort of studio thing I would set up in it, we always called it the Aviary.
Okay. Birdsong
component. And I mean, you're looking, there's a tapestry behind my head right now that we used to deaden the sound. Birds are in that too.
So it's a theme. It's just a theme that works.
And it's a theme that works, but it's actually kind of interesting because you do come to that. And I think this current situation, and you mentioned the yoga, I've decided in the post-pandemic world to lease this larger workspace and to make it a place where I can make music, teach yoga, teach my university classes online and all that sort of thing. And it too is called the Aviary. And one of the things we wanted to do was have a space that was big enough that we could have a band perform in it. Because a lot of musicians are doing this sort of live casting thing. And that's interesting because there's an intimacy to that, but it's also very constricting. And one of the challenges I always had as Birdsong, even playing in house concerts as a solo artist, because I would come to your house and be Alan when I said hello, but it was Birdsong at Morning, theoretically, that was arriving at your door. But it would just be me. And the recordings we had made become ever more elaborate. And I'm not a writer that necessarily thinks of the song and then adds stuff on top of it. I'm often thinking about all the instrumentation as part of the... So sometimes the house concerts felt a little limiting, like, well, I can't bring the string section with me, but there's 4 songs that are written for strings and I don't know how to do them. So I guess I'll leave those songs out of the mix. And likewise, it sort of felt like, a lot of this stuff has a band-oriented sound, but I can't fit them in your living room. So it's just going to be me again. So now the current setup allows for us to do a band performance. And I think in some ways, I watched people doing their living room webcasts and thought, okay, you're a band now scaling back to make it feasible to perform from your living room. And that is interesting. And maybe the people will start tuning into how we can rethink our material to fit that situation. Yeah. But I always saw it as a limitation. And I always saw my university teaching gig, I'm glad I have it, don't get me wrong, but it was also a limitation because it was very difficult to tour, to do full-time music as a result of it. So given the pandemic, and what we're doing now is this multi-camera, multi-channel pro audio band performances in this larger space with COVID screens so everyone's safe, and it's dubbed live from the Aviary. And I want to start using it as, I'm branding it that way because I want to be able to bring in different musical contexts. Maybe it's a loud, noisy rock band, and maybe the next time it's a string quartet, and maybe the next time it's my Cambodian musician and myself, maybe it's me solo. It's sort of an open-ended kind of way of approaching it.
So kind of almost like a live from Daryl's house type of thing?
Sort of like that, and there's certainly something there. But I think the thing that's like Daryl's house is that sense that there's a bunch of musicians playing in a room together. And the joy of watching those is sort of watching that interaction. Right. Different from that in that it's sort of meant to be me. It's not a guest coming into my house. I want to sort of give different aspects of what I do musically and put it out there. So I'm sure I'll do some solos that would be very much like a living room house concert would have been. And it's just me with some cameras and sound, but also other aspects musically that I might want to do, and take advantage of it. Sort of for me, it's taking advantage of the situation that says, well, you don't have to compete with a bunch of touring acts because nobody's touring. So it also makes it easier for me to get musicians to come and play, and easier to get the tech crew to come around. There's all this great gear that I've got here that's basically very, very cheap or free because it's not being used. And I'm paying people that are out of work in terms of tech crew people. So I get industry pro quality work that I would never have been able to do otherwise. And it's a little bit of the musical community thing. I found that I hesitate to ask people to do things, and then they say, "Oh, I'm so glad you called. Thank you so much." I'm like, I know I'm offended by how little I'm able to pay you for this, but no. I just am so happy to do anything. And even when I tell people about designing the Aviary, just the notion that there's a new idea being explored out there is evidently inspiring for others who are just sort of feeling trapped in their living rooms.
Yeah, there's a ton of people feeling like those people that you're hiring, photographers and all kinds of folks that are just like, hey, just call me. We'll work it out. Don't stress about the money, because there's a lot of that going on right now. So to finish up, one of the cool things that you're doing, you were working on a record called Evidence many years ago that wound up getting shelved amongst all the turmoil of your really pretty fascinating career. But now you've kind of retooled it and reinvested in it. It's called Evidence Unearthed. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
So what's the span of time between when you stopped working on it and when you started again?
Yeah, 25 years. It's been 25 years, and which is scary how much can happen in 25 years. I had a complete loss of faith with the record, and I pressed them. I have 1,000 CDs that just stay with me on shelves, and it felt like this weird little batch of songs in a period that I wasn't really. It just was like this weird void on my resume. I finally pulled it out and listened to it a few years ago and realized, the songs aren't bad. And some of the band sounds great. They play really well. What seemed a little bit off was my voice. I didn't feel like I had delivered the material with a lot of conviction. So I re-recorded all of my vocals and remixed the record, try to get it to sound a little stronger and beefier. But otherwise, it's the same recordings from 25 plus years ago. Interestingly, it's a moment in the band where at the time we recorded, it was Rick from Knots and Crosses, two drummers that had played with Knots and Crosses, and Greg. And then Greg's guitar player from his band, Thomas Giuliano, had come in. So I didn't know Thomas that well. I knew him, and it was this live on the stage kind of sound. And what's interesting is that flash forward to Birdsong, and it's the same drummer, same bass player, and now Thomas plays guitar on the Birdsong stuff. So I didn't realize it at the time, but the blueprint for Birdsong was actually on this record too. So it sounds a little bit like my Knots and Crosses world colliding with the Birdsong world. Yeah, I called it Evidence Unearthed. I took the album cover photo myself with a little remote control where I'm digging up these ADATs. That'll date the album for you. ADATs, the videotape format, right?
Yeah.
So I'm digging them up out of the ground as if I had buried them there. And it's been great to put that project to bed and to give it some respect that actually some of the material in it is worth attention. And I'm glad to have it in there. And the first Live from the Aviary show we did all material from that album. We're about to do another one on October 4. Same idea. I'll just be highlighting mostly songs from that record. And the cool thing about the webcast is Greg is still playing bass on them, thank God. Otherwise, I'm using all of these former students from UMass Lowell, where I teach. They've all graduated at different time periods, but it's nice to kind of give them a little chance to play and to expose the program, and also for me as a professor to get to make music with students kind of on I know it's my project, so it's a little bit hierarchical, but it's kind of a level playing field.
Yeah.
And when I look across the room, like at Shane, the drummer, and I'm thinking, you really truly were not alive when this record started being recorded. Like, that's what 25, 26 years will do. It will be a whole lifetime can happen in that gap.
Yeah.
So they bring all this enthusiastic 25-year-old energy to a project that is, Greg and I are in our mid late 50s, and you feel that that generation gap is present, and then it sort of dissolves. And that's what's great about the music is I become a lot younger as soon as I start playing the songs.
That's phenomenal. Well, Alan Williams of Birdsong at Morning, we'll link to your website and encourage people to check out not only the live at the Aviary, but also the yoga thing looks really cool too.
Yeah, that's a whole other tangent. But yes, I have yoga classes if you want to stretch in between, and some of them have music ingrained into them too. So
awesome. Well, it's great to have you as part of the Listening Room Network. I look forward to someday when you can make it down here to Florida, or I'm so overdue for travel. Maybe I'll come up there.
Yeah, there you go. We are existing. You probably want to come up not so much in the wintertime, but yeah. I know I've got a couple of living room hosts that I have shows booked in Florida for next summer. We will see.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, take care. Great to chat with you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Fran Snyder Podcast. Please subscribe, like, or share to help your friends discover this community. Also, I'd love to hear from you with any feedback or suggestions you have. And if you'd like to learn more about house concerts and listening rooms around the world, please visit and join listeningroomnetwork.com. You can email me from there. See you next time on the Fran Snyder Podcast.